Mark and Sarah sat across from each other at the Amber Flame, an upscale restaurant in the heart of Seattle, Washington. A single candle flickered between them, its soft light casting delicate shadows across their faces. The warm ambience of the room blended seamlessly with the hushed murmurs of other diners and the faint sound of a pianist in the corner. It was the perfect setting for an anniversary celebration, 6 years of marriage, to be exact. At first glance, the couple appeared every bit the picture of perfection. Sarah, 31, was elegant and poised, with deep brown eyes and an easy grace. Mark, 33, exuded confidence, his sharp jawline and neatly combed hair giving him a polished, composed air. Yet, behind their polite smiles, a strange tension simmered, unspoken but palpable. Sarah's fingers lightly traced the stem of her wine glass as she looked up at Mark, her gaze lingering. "Mark," she began softly, her voice almost drowned out by the clinking of glasses nearby. "Do you love me?" Mark blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Of course I do, Sarah. Why would you even ask that?" He smiled faintly, trying to lighten the mood. Sarah held his gaze, a slight hesitation in her expression. "Well," she said, leaning forward just slightly, "if you really love me, would you let me be with other men?" The smile froze on Mark's face, his fork pausing mid-air. "What?" he asked, half laughing as if she had just made a poorly timed joke. "I mean it," Sarah continued, her voice steady. "I've been thinking about it a lot. I feel like I've missed out on something, on understanding myself, on experiencing more in life." Mark stared at her, trying to process her words. "Understanding yourself?" "Sarah, we've been together for 6 years. We're happy, aren't we?" Sarah sighed, her fingers now circling the rim of her glass. "I don't know, Mark. Don't you ever think that maybe we've settled too soon? That there's more out there?" Mark's brows furrowed, his disbelief clear. "This isn't about settling, Sarah. This sounds like you're just looking for an excuse to run around with other men." Sarah leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "It's not about that," she replied defensively. "I'm talking about finding myself before we think about things like starting a family." Mark's expression softened slightly. "Sarah," he said, his voice quieter, "maybe instead of these experiments, we should think about having kids now. It's time, isn't it?" Sarah gave a bitter chuckle, shaking her head. "Kids? Mark, I'd love to have children someday. But how can I raise a family if I don't even know who I am?" Her voice dropped slightly. "I've never even been with anyone else." Mark leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "Let me get this straight," he said, his voice tinged with sarcasm. "You want to know yourself by sleeping with other men? And I'm supposed to just what? Cheer you on?" A faint smile played on Sarah's lips. "Maybe," she replied, almost teasingly. She took a sip of her wine, her eyes unwavering as they studied Mark's reaction. Then, with a coy smile, she asked, "Tell me, Mark, have you ever cheated on me? Maybe just a little fling on the side?" Mark's jaw tightened as he processed her question. "Cheat on you?" he repeated, his voice low and incredulous. "Sarah, I've never even considered it, let alone done it. Have I ever given you a reason to doubt me?" Sarah leaned forward, her finger tracing idle patterns on the linen tablecloth, a playful smirk tugging at her lips. "Come on, Mark. I've read that men are naturally wired for variety. Something about instincts, right?" She gave him a pointed look. "Statistically speaking, men cheat more often in relationships." Mark's face darkened, but his tone remained steady. "That's just an excuse people use to justify bad behavior. It all comes down to a person's character, Sarah. Loyalty isn't about instincts, it's about choices." Sarah laughed lightly, resting her chin on her hand as she gazed at him. "All right then, Mr. Moral High Ground, let me ask you something. How many women were there before me?" Mark's ears flushed slightly, but he held her gaze. "I've told you before, just one. It was a serious relationship, but it ended. Then I met you." He gestured around the room, his voice softening. "And here we are, 6 years later." Sarah raised an eyebrow, a playful grin spreading across her face. "Mark, you don't have to be shy with me. It's okay if there were more than one. You can tell me, I'm your wife. I'm not hiding anything," he said firmly, his tone sharpening. Sarah shrugged nonchalantly, her fingers brushing the edge of her wine glass. "You're too modest, Mark. I think you're just embarrassed to admit you've had your share of fun." Mark opened his mouth to reply, but before he could speak, Sarah leaned in again. Her expression shifted, becoming more serious. "Mark," she began, her voice low, "I'm being honest with you because I want this to work. I want to experience something outside of us. Just for a little while." Her eyes bore into his. "You must have thought about other women too, haven't you? Even if you're afraid to admit it." Mark's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. The warmth of the anniversary dinner was gone, replaced by an icy disbelief. "Sarah, even suggesting this means something's already broken between us. Don't you see that?" Sarah raised a hand, as if trying to calm him. "Mark, wait. Hear me out. There are couples out there who swear that opening their marriage saved their relationship. It gave them both room to breathe, to appreciate what they had. It could work for us." Mark exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. "This is absurd," he said, his voice rising slightly. "How could you even think this would help us?" Sarah's playful demeanor evaporated, replaced by irritation. "See, Mark? You're not even trying to understand me," she said, her voice cutting. "You pretend to care about my feelings, but the moment I say something that challenges your comfort zone, you shut me down." "Sarah, come on," Mark exclaimed, his frustration boiling over. "I just don't see how any of this is supposed to help us or help you. This isn't normal." "That's exactly the problem, Mark." She shot back, her tone sharp. "We're stuck in these outdated ideas about relationships. These boundaries? They're for people too scared to do anything new. Do you know how many couples live with this kind of freedom and thrive?" She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Even centuries ago, men and women had lovers and partners outside their marriages. It's not as radical as you think." Mark shook his head, trying to keep his voice steady. "Sarah, we're not living in the 1600s. We're building a life together based on trust and loyalty." Sarah's eyes flashed with determination. "If you love me, Mark, let me do this. Let me try. Don't be selfish." Her voice dropped, a whisper barely audible over the of the restaurant. At that exact moment, their waiter approached, carrying a tray of desserts. Sarah's words hung in the air like a thunderclap, and the young man's steps faltered. He glanced awkwardly between the two of them before setting the tray down and retreating quickly, his face red with embarrassment. Mark's cheeks burned as he noticed a few diners at nearby tables glancing in their direction. He leaned forward, his voice a harsh whisper. "Sarah, for God's sake, can we not have this conversation in public?" She crossed her arms, her expression defiant. "Why not? It's not like we're hiding anything." Mark closed his eyes for a moment, willing himself to stay calm. He reached for the bill and muttered under his breath, "We're going home now." Without waiting for her response, he signaled for the waiter and paid the check. They walked out in silence, the tension between them palpable. The cool Seattle air hit them as they stepped outside, but it did little to ease the heat of their unresolved argument. The drive home was silent, each second stretching into eternity. Mark's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white as his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Beside him, Sarah sat with her arms crossed, staring out the window. The Seattle streets, slick with a light drizzle, reflected the glow of streetlights, but neither of them noticed the beauty outside. When they arrived, Mark pushed open the door and stepped inside without a word. Sarah followed, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor as she set her purse down on the entryway table. As the door clicked shut behind her, Sarah broke the silence. "You know," she said, her voice sharp, "I thought being honest with you was the right thing to do. I wanted to have this conversation openly. No secrets, no sneaking around." Mark whirled around, his eyes blazing. "Openly? Sarah, what you're asking for isn't honesty. It's betrayal. You're talking about throwing everything we've built together out the window." Sarah took a step back, her arms wrapping tightly around herself. "I'm not throwing anything away, Mark. I'm trying to figure out who I am, what I need." Mark let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Figure out who you are. We've been together for 6 years, Sarah. You're my wife. Or is that not enough anymore?" She flinched at his words, but held her ground. "It's not about you not being enough, Mark. It's about me not being enough for myself." Mark stared at her, disbelief etched into his face. "Do you even hear yourself right now? Do you realize how selfish this sounds?" Sarah's voice rose, her frustration boiling over. Selfish? Maybe it is selfish, but is that so wrong? I'm tired of pretending that everything in our lives is perfect when I feel like I'm suffocating. Mark's jaw tightened as he tried to keep his temper in check. So, your solution is to blow up our marriage? To turn us into some kind of experiment? Sarah's lips trembled, but her eyes held steady. It's not an experiment, Mark. It's about growth, about giving each other space to explore. Plenty of couples have done this and come out stronger for it. Mark scoffed, shaking his head. That's Michelle talking, isn't it? Let me guess, she's the one who planted this brilliant idea in your head. Sarah bristled, her voice turning cold. Michelle understands me. She supports me, unlike you. Of course she does. Mark shot back, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Michelle, the guru of failed relationships. If anyone knows how to fix a marriage, it's her. Don't you dare insult her. Sarah snapped, her voice rising. She's been my best friend for years, long before you came along. She's always been there for me. And what about me, Sarah? Mark countered, his voice finally breaking. Have I not been there for you? Have I not supported you? Or does my opinion not matter anymore? Sarah's expression hardened, and her tone turned icy. This isn't about you, Mark. Don't make it a choice between you and her. Mark's patience snapped. He slammed his fist against the table, his voice echoing through the room. I can't believe this is even happening. You want me to just sit back and watch while you what? Run off with other men? Forget it, Sarah. Sarah stepped back, her eyes wide with shock. You're yelling, Mark, she said, her voice trembling. You're scaring me. Mark froze, the weight of her words hitting him like a freight train. Scaring you? He repeated, his voice dropping. Sarah, I've never laid a hand on you, and I never would. But this conversation is driving me insane. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, and she turned away, wiping her face with trembling hands. I can't do this right now, she murmured. I need space. Mark watched her retreat to the bedroom, the sound of drawers opening and closing sending a pang of anxiety through his chest. Sarah, he called out, his voice softer now. What are you doing? She reappeared moments later with a small overnight bag slung over her shoulder. Her eyes were red, her face pale. I'm leaving for tonight, at least, she said, her voice steady despite the quiver in her lips. I need time to think. Where are you going? Mark asked, his anger melting into concern. It's late, and it's raining. Don't worry, she replied, adjusting the strap on her shoulder. I'll go to Michelle's or find a hotel. I can't stay here right now. Mark stood frozen, watching as she opened the door and stepped out into the drizzle. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving the house eerily quiet. He sank into a chair, gripping the edge of the table as his thoughts swirled. Was she truly overwhelmed, or was this just a way to escape without guilt? The questions plagued him, their weight pressing heavily on his chest. He didn't know what to believe anymore. The house was quiet, save for the faint ticking of the wall clock. Mark sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, replaying the argument over and over. His thoughts circled endlessly. Had he pushed her too hard? Should he have been more understanding? Or was she using self-discovery as a cover for something far worse? The rain outside tapped lightly against the windows, mirroring his restless mood. His eyes fell on the notepad where he'd scribbled phrases earlier that week. Don't fall in love with women. They'll deceive you. Only a fool is certain. The wise man doubts everything. The words from the old man in the park haunted him. Could it be true? Was Sarah really seeking clarity, or was she exploiting his trust? His gut told him something wasn't right, and the photos of her recent girls' nights out with Michelle replayed in his mind. Michelle was trouble. She always had been, but Sarah had never seen it. Mark took a deep breath and made a decision. If Sarah was being honest, he had nothing to fear. But if she was lying, he needed to know. This wasn't paranoia. This was protecting himself from a greater betrayal. The next morning, Mark contacted a private investigator. He found someone reputable, a man named Robert Kane, known for his discretion and thoroughness. In his late 50s, Kane had sharp eyes and an unflappable demeanor that immediately put Mark at ease. You're not the first to come to me with this kind of situation, Kane said, leaning back in his chair. I'll keep things professional and low-key. My team will follow her movements, document everything, and provide you with concrete answers. Give me a week, and we'll know what's going on." Mark hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Do whatever it takes. I need the truth." The days stretched on as Mark tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. He threw himself into work, hoping to keep his mind occupied, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. Sarah called a few times, her tone light and friendly, as if their fight had been a minor bump in the road. "Mark, I've been thinking a lot," she said during one call. "I'm starting to see things differently. I think I was being irrational. Michelle might have influenced me more than I realized." Mark's heart lifted slightly. "I'm glad you're seeing that. Maybe we can work through this together?" "Maybe," Sarah replied softly. "But I still need a bit more time. I want to visit my parents at their farm. Clear my head." Mark agreed, though a small voice in the back of his mind questioned her sincerity. What was she really doing during this time apart? A week later, Kane called with his findings. Mark's stomach churned as he sat in Kane's office, his palms damp with sweat. "Here's what we found," Kane began, sliding a folder across the desk. Mark hesitated before opening it, bracing himself for the worst. Inside were photos of Sarah with Michelle, laughing and drinking at a crowded nightclub. There were images of Sarah with an unfamiliar man, his arm casually draped around her shoulders. Then came the hotel photos, Sarah entering and exiting with the same man, their body language intimate. "She only spent 2 days at her parents' farm," Kane explained, his tone measured. "The rest of the time, she was with Michelle or this guy." He pointed to the man in the photos. Mark's heart sank as he flipped through the evidence. It was undeniable. "What else?" he asked, his voice strained. Kane hesitated, then pulled out a separate document. "We also found this." It was a medical report, a record of Sarah's recent visit to a gynecologist. Mark's face hardened as he stared at the papers. "I see," he said quietly, his voice tight with restrained emotion. When Sarah called later that evening, her voice was warm. "Mark, I think I'm ready to come home. Let's put this all behind us, okay?" Mark forced himself to remain calm. "That's great, Sarah. Come home. Let's start fresh." The night she returned, Mark prepared a beautiful dinner, just like their anniversary night at the Amber Flame. The table was set with candles, wine, and their favorite dishes. Sarah walked in, her smile bright as she stepped into his arms. "I missed you," she whispered. Mark smiled faintly, guiding her to the table. They clinked glasses and talked, but beneath the surface, Mark's mind raced. After dinner, he stood and handed her a gift-wrapped box. "I got you something," he said. Sarah's eyes lit up as she eagerly unwrapped the box. Inside were 2 folders. Her smile faltered as she pulled them out, confusion flickering across her face. "What's this?" she asked, glancing up at him. Mark leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Open them," he said simply. With trembling hands, Sarah opened the first folder. As her eyes scanned the contents, the color drained from her face. Inside were divorce papers, stamped and ready for filing. She looked up at Mark, her lips parting in disbelief. "Mark, what is this?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Keep going," Mark replied, his tone calm but cold. Hesitating, Sarah opened the second folder. Her hands shook as she flipped through its contents. Photographs of her nights out with Michelle, arms wrapped around an unfamiliar man, and shots of her entering and leaving a hotel with him. Each page drove another nail into the coffin of her excuses. At the bottom of the stack was the medical report, a gynecological exam dated just days before her return home. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she clutched the folder to her chest. "Mark, I can explain," she said, her voice breaking. "None of this is what it looks like. Someone's setting me up." Mark let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Setting you up? Sarah, you think these photos magically appeared? The hotel receipts? The medical report? Stop lying." His voice hardened. "You spent 2 days at your parents' farm. The rest of the time, you were out with Michelle and that guy." He jabbed a finger at the photos. "Don't insult me by pretending this isn't real." Sarah's tears spilled over as she shook her head desperately. "Mark, please. I wasn't thinking clearly. It was a mistake, a stupid mistake. But it didn't mean anything." Mark stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Didn't mean anything?" He repeated, his voice rising. You threw away our marriage for something that didn't mean anything? What about all those talks we had about trust, loyalty, building a future together? Sarah sobbed, her hands clutching at the table as if it could anchor her. I was lost, Mark. I didn't know what I wanted. But I know now. I know it's you. Please, give me another chance. Mark's jaw tightened as he stared down at her, his heart a mixture of anger and grief. You were lost, he said slowly, and instead of coming to me, you chose this. You chose to lie, to cheat, to humiliate me. He pointed at the divorce papers. This is your chance, Sarah. Your chance to walk away with whatever dignity you have left. Sarah's lips trembled as she tried to form words, but nothing came. Finally, she whispered, I love you, Mark. I made a mistake, but I love you. Mark shook his head, his voice heavy with finality. No, Sarah. You love the idea of freedom more than you loved me. Enjoy it. He reached for his keys and walked toward the door. I'll see you in court. The divorce proceedings were swift and brutal. Sarah's attempts to paint herself as a victim fell flat under the weight of the evidence. Michelle remained by her side, whispering venomous words about Mark's paranoia, but it did little to sway the court's decisions. By the end, Sarah left the courtroom looking hollow, her spirit dimmed. Mark, however, felt a strange sense of relief. The weight of doubt and betrayal had lifted, leaving him with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. In the weeks that followed, Mark found himself drawn back to the park where he'd met the elderly man. He searched the benches and pathways, hoping to thank the stranger whose advice had guided him through his darkest moments. But the man was nowhere to be found. Mark asked around, describing the silver-haired gentleman with the wise eyes and calm demeanor. Each person he spoke to shook their head, claiming they hadn't seen anyone matching that description. Sitting on the same bench, overlooking the pond, Mark pondered the man's words once more. Could he have been a figment of Mark's imagination? A subconscious manifestation of the wisdom he already possessed, but needed to hear aloud? Or was he something else entirely, a messenger sent by fate? Mark would never know the truth. But as he watched the ducks swim peacefully across the pond, he felt a quiet contentment settle over him. He no longer needed answers. Months later, Mark began piecing his life back together. He poured himself into his work, reconnected with old friends, and even picked up a new hobby, photography. One afternoon, while capturing the beauty of a Seattle sunset, he noticed someone approach him. A young woman, holding a camera, smiled and asked if he needed help adjusting his lens. For the first time in a long while, Mark smiled back.